Have you ever caught yourself watching an older loved one do something that made the hairs on your neck stand up? Not because it was frightening, but because it felt so strangely out of place. Maybe it was the way they whispered to an empty chair, or hummed in the dark when no one else was around. These moments can feel eerie, but here's the truth. They're often just misunderstood parts of aging, rooted in memory, comfort, or survival. And when you look closer, what once seemed creepy can actually be a window into love, history, and resilience. Before we dive in, tap like and subscribe, because aging isn't creepy, it's simply human. Ephraim Calder is 72 years old, a retired train conductor who spent most of his life riding the long rails of Ohio, guiding passengers through snowstorms, sunsets, and countless miles of track. His life has always been defined by rhythm, the steady clatter of wheels, the whistle echoing through small towns, the schedules that never stopped. But now in retirement, the rhythm is slower, quieter, sometimes unsettling for the people around him. Since losing his wife 3 years ago, Ephraim has lived alone in the same modest house they once filled with laughter. His daughter Miriam checks in often, bringing groceries or staying for coffee, but she can't help noticing the little things that feel odd. The muttered conversations in the hallway, the unusual food combinations left in the fridge, the way he stares out the window as though waiting for a train that never comes. To her, and sometimes to neighbors, these habits feel eerie, almost like shadows of a man fading into mystery. Yet beneath every quirk is a story, grief softened by memory, loneliness soothed by ritual, wisdom wrapped in strange routines. Ephraim isn't losing himself. He's adapting in ways outsiders don't immediately understand. And his story reminds us that what we label as creepy is often just the language of aging. A code that, once cracked, reveals something deeply human. 1. Talking to himself in empty rooms. Ephraim spends long afternoons in his basement, carefully adjusting the miniature tracks of his beloved model train set. The room is quiet except for the click of his tools and the low murmur of his own voice. To anyone passing by, it might sound unsettling, almost as if he's holding a private conversation with someone who isn't there. His daughter once paused at the door, listening, and swore it sounded like he was talking to ghosts. She even admitted it gave her chills. But what seems creepy on the surface is actually something far more practical and human. Ephraim is talking himself through the process, reminding his mind of each step as he repairs tiny wheels, oils tracks, and sets schedules for trains that will never leave the basement. Psychologists call it self-talk, and while it may sound unusual, it's one of the brain's natural tools for keeping sharp. For seniors, it can strengthen memory, improve focus, and even ease feelings of loneliness. Ephraim isn't slipping away into delusion. He's using words to anchor himself, to keep his thinking steady. It's not so different from an athlete psyching themselves up before a game, or a chef talking through a recipe. The real mistake families often make is trying to hush or correct this habit, thinking it's a sign of decline. Instead, the better approach is to join in. If you hear your loved one talking through a task, step closer and ask a question. What are you working on today? Or, tell me how that train works. By turning his private muttering into a shared dialogue, his daughter discovered that what once felt eerie became an invitation, an opening to connect with her father in a new way. And in that connection, the creepy disappeared, leaving only warmth and understanding. 2. Obsessing over obituaries. Every morning, before the coffee pot even finishes brewing, Ephraim settles into his favorite armchair with the local newspaper spread across his lap. His eyes always drift to one particular section, the obituaries. He scans each name slowly, as if searching for someone he once knew, occasionally nodding quietly or shaking his head with a sigh. To his daughter Miriam, this ritual has always felt unsettling. She once admitted it seemed as though her father was waiting for his own turn, marking the days by the departures of others. The house in those moments feels heavy, as if Ephraim is living among shadows. But what looks morbid at first glance is actually a deeply human practice. For Ephraim, reading obituaries isn't about obsession with death, it's about connection. These pages are a roll call of his community. Old co-workers, neighbors from decades past, even distant acquaintances whose stories remind him of chapters in his own life. Each name carries a memory, a flash of laughter shared on a train ride, or a face glimpsed at a town festival. By reading these notices, Ephraim isn't just acknowledging loss, he's preserving fragments of history that would otherwise vanish. For families, the key is to shift perspective. Instead of reacting with discomfort or worry, turn the ritual into a bridge. Ask questions like, did you know this person well? or what do you remember about them? These small prompts can unlock powerful stories, an oral history that might otherwise remain untold. Miriam discovered that when she leaned into her father's morning habit, she wasn't listening to a man obsessed with endings. She was gathering pieces of a lifetime, one name at a time. In this light, the obituary page isn't creepy at all. It becomes a quiet celebration of connection, memory, and the threads that tie a senior's life to the larger story of community. 3. Collecting strange food pairings. One evening, Miriam walked into the kitchen and froze at the sight of her father carefully dipping a crunchy pickle spear into melted chocolate. Ephraim bit into it with complete satisfaction, smiling as if it were the finest dessert. To her, the combination seemed bizarre, almost unsettling. She couldn't decide if it was a joke or a sign of something gone wrong. Watching him relish such an odd pairing gave her chills, the kind that come when you see something outside of what you consider normal. But for Ephraim, there was nothing creepy about it. His taste buds, like those of many seniors, had changed with age. Foods that once seemed flavorful now felt bland, while unusual combinations sparked his palate in surprising ways. Some of his choices were born out of curiosity, while others carried hidden nostalgia, memories of trying quirky snacks during train journeys or recalling wartime meals where creativity made up for scarcity. Medical experts confirm that aging can dull taste sensitivity, often pushing seniors towards stronger, saltier, or sweeter combinations. Pairings that younger generations find strange may actually provide comfort or rekindle forgotten moments. For families, the key isn't to discourage these habits, but to guide them gently. Miriam learned that instead of wrinkling her nose or scolding her father, she could encourage balance, keeping the fun of his food experiments while ensuring his overall nutrition stayed sound. By suggesting healthier twists, like dipping fruit in dark chocolate instead of pickles, she honored his creativity while caring for his health. What started as an unsettling sight at the kitchen table became a reminder. Sometimes the strangest habits are just seniors finding joy in the small, surprising corners of life. 4. Nighttime wandering. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Miriam woke to the creak of floorboards. She tiptoed down the hall and found her father pacing slowly from the kitchen to the living room, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes distant. The dim glow of the lamp made the scene feel eerie, almost as if he were haunted by something unseen. For a moment, Miriam felt a chill. Why was he awake, walking the house like a restless spirit? In truth, Ephraim's midnight wandering was far from mysterious. Seniors often struggle with disrupted sleep cycles, and in his case, insomnia and the side effects of certain medications made restful nights difficult. What looked like ghostly pacing was actually his way of coping with a body and mind that refused to shut down when the world went quiet. For families, it's easy to misinterpret this habit as something ominous, when really it's a signal to look deeper. Creating calming nighttime rituals can make a world of difference. A warm cup of soothing tea, a dimmed bedroom light, or gentle background music can ease the transition into sleep. Making sure the home is safe for nighttime movement, removing clutter, securing rugs, and keeping hallways softly lit helps protect against falls when wandering does occur. Miriam eventually learned to approach these midnight strolls not with fear, but with empathy. Instead of shooing her father back to bed, she began encouraging habits that made his evenings more restful. Over time, the pacing became less frequent, and what once felt like a haunting presence in the night turned into a reminder that even in aging, small changes can bring peace. 5. Talking to photographs. Late at night, when the house is still and only the hum of the refrigerator breaks the silence, Miriam sometimes hears her father's voice drifting softly from the living room. Curious and unsettled, she once peeked around the corner and saw Ephraim leaning toward a framed photograph of his late wife, speaking in a whisper as though she was still sitting beside him. The sight gave Miriam goosebumps. It felt eerie, almost like he was conversing with someone who no longer belonged to this world. But what she witnessed was not a sign of delusion. It was grief expressed in its gentlest form. For Ephraim, speaking to the photo was his way of keeping a bond alive, of easing the sharp edges of loneliness that cut deepest at night. These quiet conversations gave him comfort, a sense that his partner's presence hadn't vanished completely, but lingered in memory and love. Experts explain that seniors often use these rituals as a coping mechanism. Talking to a photo, humming a shared song, or repeating a loved one's name out loud are not signs of confusion. They are acts of healing. They help preserve emotional balance when the absence feels too large to bear. Instead of treating it as something unsettling, families can honor these habits with compassion. Miriam learned that rather than interrupting or dismissing her father, she could ask gentle questions afterward like, "What do you miss most about her?" or "Tell me a story from when you first met." Encouraging journaling, or even creating a small memory-sharing circle with family, helped Ephraim transform private whispers into collective storytelling. In this way, what once felt haunting became something deeply human, a testimony that love doesn't disappear. It simply finds new forms of expression. 6. Whispering or humming alone. On quiet afternoons, when the house seemed to settle into its own silence, Ephraim would often begin to hum. Sometimes it was the faint sound of a train whistle, other times the soft, nostalgic melody of 1940s jazz that once played in the background of his youth. His grandchildren, visiting for the weekend, found it unsettling. They whispered to each other that Grandpa's humming made the house feel spooky, like a tune floating out of nowhere. But what they didn't realize is that Ephraim's habit was not strange at all. It was soothing. Humming is a natural way to regulate breathing, calm the nervous system, and lower anxiety. For seniors, especially those living alone, it also fills the silence with something familiar and comforting. Each tune Ephraim carried wasn't random. It was a thread connecting him to his past, to the rhythm of the trains he once conducted, and to the music that marked the happiest moments of his life. Families sometimes mistake these sounds as eerie echoes, but they are often a senior's way of finding comfort when the world feels too still. The best way to respond is not to quiet the humming, but to join it. Miriam learned that when she or the children softly hummed along, what once felt spooky quickly transformed into a bonding ritual. Suddenly the house wasn't haunted by odd sounds. It was alive with shared voices and warm memories. By leaning into these small quirks, rather than resisting them, families can transform unsettling moments into opportunities for connection. Ephraim's humming wasn't a sign of strangeness. It was a simple act of keeping his spirit steady, and an open invitation for others to join in the song. 7. Fixation on rituals about death. One afternoon, Miriam discovered a neatly labeled box tucked away in her father's closet. Inside were important papers, prepaid funeral arrangements, and even a handwritten list titled "Departure Wishes." At first, the sight shook her. She felt like she had stumbled into something morbid, as if her father were quietly preparing to disappear. The idea that he had organized his own funeral left her uneasy, and she admitted it made the house feel colder that day. Yet for Ephraim, this ritual wasn't about dwelling on death. It was about responsibility, about making sure his loved ones would not be left scrambling in confusion or debt when the time came. Seniors who create departure boxes or plan their funerals in advance are often motivated not by fear, but by love. They want their children to inherit peace, not paperwork, memories, not medical bills. Instead of treating these actions as grim, families can reframe them as acts of foresight. Miriam eventually realized that her father's planning was a gift, one that would spare her from making painful choices in moments of grief. Still, she felt the need to balance the heaviness. Together they added lighter touches to his plans, songs he wanted played at a celebration of life, recipes for his favorite meals, even a request for laughter instead of tears. By shifting perspective, what once felt unsettling transformed into an expression of love and clarity. Ephraim's so-called morbid ritual was not an obsession with endings. It was his way of leaving behind order, dignity, and one final act of care for the people he cherished most. 8. Staring into space for long periods. One autumn afternoon, Miriam walked into the living room and found her father sitting motionless in his old wooden rocker. His hands rested on the armrests, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, glazed over as though he was staring through the walls themselves. Nearly an hour passed, and he hadn't shifted his gaze or spoken a word. To Miriam it felt eerie, almost as if Ephraim had slipped into another world and left his body behind. For a moment she feared he was gone, present in form but absent in spirit. But what looked unsettling was far less mysterious than it appeared. Seniors often spend extended periods in reflection, letting memories surface like old film reels playing silently in their minds. For Ephraim, these quiet spells were not emptiness but depth. He was revisiting boyhood summers along the Ohio River, remembering the first time he saw his wife at a town dance, or replaying the sound of train whistles echoing across snowy tracks. These still moments were his way of resting his mind and savoring his past. The key for families is to recognize that silence does not always mean isolation. Instead of rushing to wake him up from these reveries, try approaching gently with an open-ended question. What are you thinking about right now? Or, tell me what memory you just saw. Miriam discovered that these questions often sparked rich conversations. What once seemed like an eerie, vacant stare transformed into opportunities for storytelling and connection. In truth, Ephraim wasn't drifting away. He was anchoring himself in the places and people that shaped him. And by being invited into those moments, his family learned that even silence can hold a treasure of meaning. 9. Paranormal fascination. Most evenings, after dinner dishes were cleared, Ephraim would sink into his recliner, flip through the channels, and land on ghost hunting shows. He watched intently as investigators crept through abandoned buildings, whispering about shadows and cold spots. Miriam once walked in and found him nodding along, as though he had joined their search for the supernatural. To her, it felt strange, even unsettling, that her 72-year-old father seemed so fascinated by ghosts and spirits. She wondered why a man his age would spend his evenings with programs that felt more spooky than sensible. But what looked odd on the surface was actually a spark of imagination. Paranormal shows offered Ephraim something more than cheap thrills. They kept his mind engaged with mystery, possibility, and questions bigger than everyday life. For seniors, curiosity is a powerful antidote to loneliness. The unknown invites wonder, and wonder keeps the brain alive.
Ephraim wasn't drifting into superstition. He was keeping himself entertained in a way that challenged routine and sparked playfulness.
For families, the best approach isn't to roll eyes or dismiss these habits as childish. Instead, meet them with humor and light-hearted curiosity. Miriam discovered that when she sat beside her father and teased, "Do you think that creaky floorboard was really a ghost?" Ephraim would laugh, and the eerie tension melted away. Soon, the shows became a shared joke, a way to bond rather than a cause for worry. What once seemed like a creepy obsession turned into simple entertainment, a reminder that seniors, just like anyone else, crave stories that stir the imagination. And sometimes, even in the twilight years, a little fascination with the unknown is what keeps life feeling vibrant. In the beginning, Miriam couldn't help but feel unsettled by her father's habits. The late-night pacing, the quiet whispers to her mother's photograph, the strange food pairings, and even his fascination with ghost shows, all of it painted a picture that seemed odd, even a little chilling. It was easy to mistake these moments as signs that something was wrong, that Ephraim was slipping further away from the man he once was. But as she began to look closer, the truth unfolded in unexpected ways. Each so-called creepy behavior was not a descent into strangeness, but a reflection of his humanity. Talking to himself kept his mind sharp. Reading obituaries connected him to his community. Staring into space was not emptiness, but rich reflection. Even his playful obsession with the paranormal kept his imagination alive. What felt eerie at first was actually love, grief, memory, and survival, finding new forms of expression. The transformation wasn't in Ephraim, it was in the way his family chose to see him. They learned that empathy had the power to turn fear into connection and judgment into understanding. With every small shift in perspective, the quirks that once made them uneasy became reminders of a life deeply lived. What feels eerie is often just misunderstood love, memory, or survival. Replace judgment with empathy, and aging becomes less about fear and more about connection. If this opened your eyes, hit like. It tells YouTube this wisdom matters. Share this with someone who needs a fresh perspective on aging, and subscribe to Better Aging Advice, because every quirk has a story, and every senior deserves to be understood.